How are you feeling? You got John Riggs here today looking at Super Nintendo games and specifically those from SquareSoft. Now before Square-Enix, there was Square and there was Enix. We'll talk about Enix in another video another time. Today it's all about Square. They didn't make a whole lot of games for the Super Nintendo, but the ones they made were all quality. We're going to cover all of them in this video and we're going to rank them along the way. Now this is part of a regular series, but I do other videos too. I'm a huge old school gamer. Make sure you're subscribed. I do at least 2 videos a week. There's always something new coming up. And when I hit 100,000 subscribers, I'm going to do a contest where I put someone in their own Nintendo homebrew, and it could be you. Make sure you're subscribed for your first chance to win. Starting off with Breath of Fire. Breath of Fire was great because when it came out, there was the Final Fantasies, there was the Dragon Warriors, Dragon Quest now, and but Breath of Fire was like the, oh cool, here's a new IP, here's a new game, here's a new something or other, familiar how to play, but something new, and especially when it comes to 16-bit, super underrated soundtrack on Breath of Fire. Absolutely love this game. It's an RPG, it is a turn-based RPG. My feelings on turn-based RPGs are, I'd rather have the action element, but you know what, every once in a while it's nice to chill and plan your attacks accordingly, and always cool to see what kind of, you know, like the graphics that are out there, the build, the anticipation, the using your items and all that too. There is a thing behind these turn-based RPGs that someone can really get behind once they get into it like that. Again, I'd rather just hit the sword button and slash someone, but you know, when it comes to RPGs, Breath of Fire, to me personally, it's one of the best ones out there, especially the first one, such a trailblazer, no pun intended, for this game. I like this one quite a bit, and I'm giving this one an A. Well, this is an S. This is Chrono Trigger. And how can it not be an S? Again, one of the most stellar soundtracks, even by today's standards. Love this game. Turn-based, kind of. When you run into an enemy, it turns into this kind of, like you can still kind of move around a little bit, or you set up your thing so there's still like a playing field, like a battlefield. It was an interesting thing for its time. It's interesting because this came right after Secret of Mana. And Secret of Mana, you use your attack button to kill enemies. This one, it looks like it could do that, but then it doesn't. So very interesting how they did this with Chrono Trigger. But the multiple endings, I've still never beaten the game. I've still never beaten it all the way through, or I've still never played it all the way through. Rather, just the color and the graphics and the sound. And when this game came out, this was like pinnacle. Hard to top this game when it comes to the graphics and the music and the sound and the storytelling and everything that goes into making a great game. And Chrono Trigger. Way up near the top of the list for great games on the Super Nintendo. It has to be an S. Final Fantasy II, which we found out later on was Final Fantasy IV in the total of series. And I was like, oh, it's called Final Fantasy II. I loved Final Fantasy for the NES. It was one of my favorites for the NES. And now here's Final Fantasy II, and it was way better. It was so much better. Oh my god. Again, all these games are going to have great music, all right? So I'm going to mention that every single time. I'm not going to stop talking about it. I will literally never stop talking about how great the music is for SquareSoft games. And again, with the story and the elements. I thought it was cool you start out as the bad guy. You start out as, you know, the bad guy, and it's a story of redemption and discovering yourself and doing the right thing and choosing your sides and all that. And there's a great story involved with this game, and just even the first opening moments when the game starts, when it has that kind of like mode 7 scrolling, you're like, it's like, oh man, I can't, because I mean, can't wait. I can't wait to see what else this game's gonna do. And this game took you on said journey. And Final Fantasy II, in my humble opinion, because I have more nostalgia for it, I like this one more than Final Fantasy III, but Final Fantasy II definitely an S in my book. Which brings us to Final Fantasy III, which we found out was Final Fantasy VI, which meant that we lost a Super Nintendo game in Final Fantasy V, which, by the way, is one of my favorite Final Fantasy games of all time. I absolutely love Final Fantasy V, but for this list, we're only doing the US releases published by SquareSoft. In Final Fantasy III, I'll call it Final Fantasy III, just that's what it's called in the US, this game had what was going on with Final Fantasy II and just more of it. And there's other things like when they involve not just fire and ice and lightning bolts and stuff like that, but then when you have characters with a chainsaw or or sword battle techniques or a ninja with his dog and stuff like that. Just the fun creative characters that this game had really, to me, held the story together. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Kefka, the boss, the big baddie, and Final Fantasy III could be the coolest villain of all time. Like, more than Joker. I mean, and I'm talking about like not just in like video game history, but comics, movies, everything. Just the idea of him and who he is and what he does and what he doesn't care about and how he goes about his business. There's something about Kefka that that just puts an evil grin on my face. I don't know. I can't explain it, and maybe I don't even want to talk to a psychiatrist about it, but I do love Final Fantasy III. Even though I like Final Fantasy II more, Final Fantasy III is still definitely a solid S. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was slated as a RPG for beginners, but make no mistake about it, it's still a great game. It is not a watered-down Final Fantasy game. The fact that they put Final Fantasy on it was just to sell more copies of it, which is fine. I don't blame them for doing this. It's the same as Final Fantasy Legend for the Game Boy. Not very Final Fantasy. And this game here, it's part of the Saga series, but Saga wasn't a thing here in the US. So they said, well, let's just call it Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and it'll work. And you know what? Final Fantasy games traditionally, I mean, all of them up to this point had different characters, different stories, different worlds, different whatever. So it's like you can call it whatever you want. You can do whatever you want with it. And Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, I still think it's great. It doesn't play like the other Final Fantasy games, but it's still a turn-based RPG. Yeah, it is a little bit on the easier side because it kind of walks you through where you should go. And if you fight all the enemies along the way, you don't have to grind. The grinding is just doing the little challenges that they have. And then you're good, and then you build up levels. By doing so, you come in contact with other characters who will join your party who have the items you need. It features a jump button, my friend. This was revolutionary, because man, how many times have you been trying to go down a narrow corridor that only fits one person, and the door's on the other side, and there's some jerk who's just like walking into a wall that can't go anywhere, and you just need to get past him, and he's not leaving. You're just like, dude. This game has a jump button. You can jump over them. I love it. And you can also use your items and stuff along the way. So it has that kind of Zelda-y thing where you can use your items to, clear a path. But then when it comes to the fight scenes, and you can see the enemies clearly on the thing, so there's no surprises when the enemies are going to pop up at you. Then you can go through and fight the enemies. And I loved the fact the enemies took damage, or when they took damage, they changed their appearance. They became more wilted, or they got more scruff marks on them or something like that. So you can kind of see, you can't really see their hit points, but you can tell when they're kind of on the tail end of not living, if that makes sense. I love Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Like I said, a bit on the easy side. I'm giving this one an A. It's still a fun playthrough today. Secret of Evermore was fantastic. It was amazing because it didn't take place in the fantastical world of fantasy and dragons and light. And I mean, there's a little bit of kind of some of that stuff later on in the game. It takes place in the US, Podunk, USA, which I think many of us can agree that our town, whatever town you happen to be in, is like, that's my town, man. The rundown movie theater and stuff like that. It's a boy and his dog, and he goes through and he ends up in a different land, and his dog becomes like mutant buff monster dog or whatever. And you do those things too. But it was cool to have an RPG. I mean, we had Earthbound, but it was cool to have an RPG like this. That took place in just like the U.S. It was like you play as like some dude, some kid. Right? And it plays not like the turn-based style. This goes back to like the Secret of Mana style, kind of Legend of Zelda style a little bit, but much more like Secret of Mana, where if you can't just keep attacking, you have to hit, and then you have to let your meter charge up, and then you can really give the impact of the full blow here of whatever your weapons happens to be. Great game, fun game. It was the game that taught me what alchemy stood for, I think. I remember alchemy being a thing about this game later on. And I never played all the way through it. I never beat it, but I loved playing it. And whenever I come back to it, I'm just like, man, how come I just need to sit down, hunker down, play it all the way through. Great game, and I'm giving this one an A. Which brings us to Secret of Mana. Now, this game blew my mind the first time I played it. I loved it. I loved this idea, I loved the story. I liked the fact that it was at the time I called it like a Zelda type game, because you slash your sword and you hit the enemy. And it had, again, like Secret of Evermore, it has that charge up meter. That was the first time I saw that in a game like this, or in this kind of game. I loved Secret of Mana. I get nostalgic just listening to the music of the game. Like sometimes, I'll just always go on YouTube or something like that, just look up the soundtrack, and it'll whisk me back to a time when I was like 16. How old was I when that game came out? I think I had to have been around 16 or so, 15 or 16, something like that. This game's a lot longer than I gave it credit for. This game, it is not a game that you can probably beat over a weekend. If you can, man, more power to you, because there's a lot, so much going on with this game. And I love the fact that you could have multiple players on it. You could actually, my friend and I could play together to take down these bosses, to take down these enemies, to team up, like I'll hit and then charge. And then while they do that, they'll hit and they'll use magic. Yeah, you can set up your AI to do all that for you too, but it was so much fun. Couch co-op with Secret of Mana. This game, to me personally, I might get some flack for this. To me, this game would be an S. I'm giving it an A. It would be an S. It's just so redundant. It's the same. I don't want to say the word. I'll say the word. It gets boring after a while. It just gets to the same thing over and over. And I guess you could say the same thing about The Legend of Zelda. You can say the same thing about a lot of games. But the more I wanted to play this game, the more I kept going, the more I'm like, where's the ending already? How much more of this game is there? And to some, that's a good thing. To some, it's like, man, I don't want this game to end ever. But for me, it's just like, I got other games I want to play, and I want to make sure I complete this game before I go on to something else. I never beat it. Not for the lack of trying. I just, moved on to other games, and then when I came back to this game, I forgot where I was and had to start all over again. And and I have this one. I have it on the Super Nintendo. I got it again on the Nintendo Switch. Huge fan of this game. Don't get it twisted. I love this game. But if it wasn't for the redundancy, I would have given it an S. But to me, it's an A. Sorry. I'll be showcasing and ranking games from Enix, LJN, and THQ, all for the Super Nintendo, coming up in the near future. Make sure you're subscribed. Those videos are coming out very soon. I've been doing this style of video for a while with the NES, so make sure you check out some of these other videos too. And we're on the road to 100,000 subscribers, and I thank you for your support. When I hit 100,000, I'm going to do a giveaway where I put someone in their own NES homebrew. Make sure you're subscribed. You could be winner.